A lion gets a life-saving procedure from an unlikely surgeon, a small bird. But a week later, a grim twist unfolds. Wildlife photographer Thomas Reed finally lowered his camera, his fingers locked in a stiff curl after maintaining the exact same posture for nearly 4 hours within his dusty concealment. The familiar dry heat of the Kenyan savanna had replaced the early morning chill of the Masai Mara, the warmth appearing to radiate directly from the parched earth. His extended vigil had ultimately paid off. The male lion he had pursued for the better part of a week had chosen a spot less than 50 yards from Thomas's hide to rest. Peering through his telephoto lens, it was clear the magnificent beast was suffering. Known to local guides as Jabari, this lion was a celebrated figure in the Mara, instantly recognizable by a unique dark patch within his mane and an unusual indifference to the presence of safari vehicles. But on this day, Jabari appeared indifferent to everything but his own agony. The source was plain to see. A fierce, swollen abscess bulged from the right side of his face, nestled just below the jawline. The infection had ballooned to the size of a grapefruit, its skin stretched so taut and shiny it bore a menacing purplish-red tinge visible even from a distance. "That's not promising," Thomas murmured into his notepad, meticulously recording observations. With over 15 years of experience capturing predators across Africa, he was no stranger to such infections. Without intervention, these abscesses often proved lethal, particularly near the throat or jaw where swelling could block an animal's ability to eat or drink. In the wild, there were no veterinarians to perform a lancing, no antibiotics to combat the bacteria. Nature followed its own course, sometimes merciful, frequently brutal. Thomas had recorded cases of lions overcoming seemingly devastating injuries, while others perished slowly from what began as minor wounds. Jabari lay motionless beneath an acacia, his heavy head resting on his paws. He would occasionally shake his mane, as if bothered by an irritant, or half-heartedly paw at the swollen mass, though these attempts seemed to exacerbate his pain. The sovereign of the savannah was reduced to a portrait of misery. Thomas was so engrossed in documenting the lion's state that he nearly overlooked the oxpecker. This small, brown bird with its signature red bill landed casually on the ground near Jabari. It hopped toward the enormous predator with astonishing boldness, its head tilting inquisitively with each step. Oxpeckers were a common sight across the plains, frequently seen riding the backs of rhinos, buffalo, and giraffes as they feasted on ticks and parasites. It was a classic mutualistic arrangement. The mammals received a grooming service, and the birds secured a meal. Yet Thomas had seldom witnessed them interacting with lions, whose fastidious self-grooming usually left little for the birds to harvest. This particular oxpecker, however, was intensely fixated on Jabari. To Thomas's amazement, the bird leapt directly onto the lion's foreleg and began a deliberate path toward the abscess. Jabari, possibly too wretched to care, barely acknowledged the tiny visitor. Through his lens, Thomas watched as the bird started to peck delicately at the taut skin of the swelling. Its actions seemed intentional, almost surgical, honing in on a specific spot near the center where the skin was stretched to a near-translucent thinness. "No way," Thomas breathed, increasing his shutter speed to preserve what he anticipated was about to occur. After several minutes of careful work, the oxpecker's beak finally breached the abscess wall. The result was instantaneous and violent. The pressurized pocket ruptured, ejecting a stream of purulent fluid onto the ground. Jabari winced, lifting his head with a low rumble, yet he made no move to strike the bird. To the contrary, the lion remained still as the oxpecker resumed its task, now deliberately enlarging the opening to facilitate further drainage. This process continued for nearly 20 minutes, the bird methodically cleaning the wound as pus and blood flowed freely. Thomas documented every second, his shutter clicking in a steady rhythm as he captured this extraordinary event. In all his years, he had never witnessed anything like it. Once the abscess was substantially drained, the bird turned its attention to cleaning the surrounding fur, efficiently removing the sticky residue with precise pecks. Most remarkably, it would periodically return to the wound itself, its small beak precisely extracting what looked like tiny fragments of debris, perhaps the thorns or splinters that had sparked the infection originally. "This is unbelievable," Thomas whispered, already envisioning the impact these images would have. They were more than just remarkable photos, they represented a potentially groundbreaking record of interspecies cooperation rarely observed by science. As the sun climbed higher, sharpening the shadows, Jabari finally rose. The now deflated abscess, draining freely, already appeared less inflamed. The lion shook his impressive mane, sending the oxpecker briefly into the air, but the bird quickly resettled. When Jabari ambled toward a nearby waterhole, the oxpecker stayed perched on his shoulder, occasionally returning to inspect its work. Thomas hastily packed his gear and radioed his guide, Moses, waiting half a mile away at their vehicle. "You have to see this. Bring the video equipment, I've captured something remarkable here." By the time Moses arrived, Jabari had reached the water. For what Thomas suspected was the first time in days, the lion could drink without the abscess's pressure causing excruciating pain. The oxpecker lingered nearby on a reed, watching its enormous patient with what Thomas couldn't help but interpret as satisfaction. "I've never witnessed this," Moses said quietly, filming the scene. A Maasai who had grown up on these lands and guided for 2 decades, Moses possessed an exhaustive knowledge of local fauna. Oxpeckers sometimes tend wounds on buffalo or zebra, but never a lion, not like this. Over the subsequent 3 days, Thomas and Moses returned to track Jabari's recovery. The progress was stunning. The swelling had dramatically reduced, and the wound continued to drain cleanly. The oxpecker, or perhaps different individuals of the same species, kept visiting the lion, cleaning the area and removing parasites from his coat. By day 4, Jabari had reunited with his pride, 2 lionesses and 4 cubs who had apparently kept their distance during his illness. Although still favoring his injured side, the lion managed to join a zebra hunt, letting the females handle the heavy work. "This is going to make an incredible feature," Thomas told Moses as they watched the pride feed. "A tiny bird rescues the king of beasts. No one would believe it without these photographs." Moses nodded, though his expression held a note of caution. "The wound looks better, certainly, but infections can be deceptive. The bird helped, but we shouldn't celebrate prematurely." Thomas pondered this as he scrolled through images on his camera display. The shots were phenomenal, frame after frame documenting the unlikely alliance between predator and bird. National Geographic had already expressed interest after seeing his initial photos. Thomas had even started brainstorming titles for the potential article, "The Lion's Physician" or maybe "Unlikely Savior." Still, Moses's warning lingered. They'd witnessed a seemingly miraculous recovery, but these were wild animals in a harsh environment where countless invisible factors could influence survival. "We'll keep monitoring him," Thomas decided. Documenting the full recovery will only strengthen the story. Neither man could have foreseen how drastically events would shift, or how their straightforward documentation of a natural interaction would evolve into something far more complex and heartbreaking. Thomas's images of the oxpecker and Jabari spread through the wildlife research community with astonishing speed. By week's end, his inbox overflowed with messages from biologists, veterinarians, and conservation groups worldwide. Prestigious scientific journals requested full documentation of the interaction, while the BBC Natural History Unit expressed interest in featuring the story. "I've never encountered such a response," Thomas told Moses as they tracked Jabari's pride through morning mist, 6 days after first documenting the abscess drainage. Cornell University wants to establish a formal study of oxpecker-predator interactions based on these observations. Moses nodded thoughtfully, scanning the horizon. "People are captivated because it challenges our assumptions about animal relationships. The bird should fear the lion, yet it approached in his moment of weakness." They located the pride resting in a shallow dip near a cluster of umbrella acacias. The lionesses lounged in the warming morning while the cubs wrestled playfully. Jabari lay slightly apart, his massive frame still except for the steady rhythm of his breathing. Something about the lion's posture troubled Thomas. Unlike previous days when Jabari had been alert and increasingly active, today he seemed unusually lethargic. Through his telephoto lens, Thomas could see that the area around the former abscess, which had been healing nicely, now appeared swollen again, with angry redness spreading down the lion's neck. "This doesn't look promising," Thomas murmured, handing the binoculars to Moses. The infection seems to have returned, and it's worse than before. Moses studied the lion with concern. His breathing is labored, see how his sides are heaving? The pride is keeping their distance. They sense something's wrong. As they watched, Jabari attempted to rise but faltered, managing only to drag himself a few feet before collapsing again. The effort appeared to exhaust him completely. One lioness approached cautiously, sniffing at her pride mate before retreating with a low growl. We should contact the Mara veterinary unit, Thomas decided, reaching for his satellite phone. The Masai Mara National Reserve maintained a small team of wildlife veterinarians who occasionally intervened in severe cases, particularly those involving human-caused injuries. This could be septicemia, blood poisoning from the infection. If so, he'll die without antibiotics. Moses shook his head slowly. They rarely intervene with adult lions unless the cause is human-related, a snare or gunshot wound. They'll call this nature's course. We don't know what caused the original abscess, Thomas countered. It could have been a poacher's dart that got infected, or wire from an illegal fence. We should at least report it. While Thomas made the call, Moses continued observing. The oxpecker has returned, he reported, gesturing. Several of them, actually. Through his lens, Thomas watched 3 oxpeckers land near Jabari. Unlike the confident approach he'd documented days earlier, these birds seemed hesitant, hopping nervously around the stricken lion rather than immediately attending to the wound. Finally, one ventured closer, briefly pecking at the swollen area before retreating. They sense something's different, Moses observed. Perhaps the infection has changed, or gone deeper. The veterinary coordinator promised to review Thomas's report but cautioned that intervention was unlikely without clear evidence of human involvement. Natural diseases and infections, however unfortunate, were considered part of the ecosystem's balance. Throughout the day, Thomas and Moses maintained their vigil. Jabari's condition visibly worsened. His breathing grew more labored, and he stopped responding to the cubs' play or the warning calls when a buffalo herd passed downwind. The oxpeckers continued their nervous attendance, now primarily cleaning around the wound rather than interacting with it directly. By late afternoon, a park ranger vehicle pulled alongside them. Dr. Leah Kamani, one of the reserve's wildlife veterinarians, greeted them with a grim expression. I've reviewed your photographs from last weekend today, she explained after introductions. I'm concerned this may be a resistant bacterial infection, possibly Fusobacterium necrophorum. When the abscess drained, it likely provided temporary relief, but without antibiotics, the deeper infection continued spreading. Can you treat him? Thomas asked. Dr. Kamani surveyed the scene, her experienced eyes assessing Jabari's condition. Normally, we wouldn't intervene in what appears to be a natural infection. However, I'm concerned about potential transmission to the cubs if this is something unusual or particularly virulent. I'd like to at least obtain a sample and check his vitals. Using the tranquilizer gun from her vehicle, Dr. Kamani carefully darted Jabari. The lion barely reacted, a worrying sign of his weakened state. Within minutes, he was unconscious, allowing the team to approach safely. Up close, the severity of Jabari's condition became alarmingly clear. The infection had spread well beyond the original abscess site, creating a network of inflamed tissue down his neck and into his chest. His temperature was dangerously high, his breathing raspy and uneven. This is more serious than I thought, Dr. Kamani admitted, collecting samples and administering a broad-spectrum antibiotic. The infection has likely entered his bloodstream. At this stage, even with treatment, his chances aren't good. Could the birds have made it worse? Thomas asked, thinking of how the oxpeckers had opened the abscess. Did they spread the infection somehow? Actually, they probably extended his life, the veterinarian replied, preparing a second injection. Without that initial drainage, the abscess would have continued growing until it interfered with his breathing or ability to eat. What likely happened is that the core of the infection, perhaps a foreign object or a particularly resistant bacteria pocket, remained after the surface drainage. When his immune system weakened, it flared up again with greater virulence. As Dr. Kamani worked, the lionesses watched warily from a distance, occasionally growing restless enough that Moses started the jeep's engine as a deterrent. The oxpeckers had scattered when the humans approached but remained perched in nearby trees, their characteristic calls punctuating the tense silence. "I've done what I can," Dr. Kamani finally said, packing her equipment. "I've given him antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, and fluids. The next 24 hours will be critical. If he survives the night, he might have a chance." As the tranquilizer wore off, Jabari remained unnaturally still, his massive body rising and falling with labored breaths. The pride kept their distance, the lionesses seemingly understanding that their male was fighting a battle beyond their comprehension. Thomas and Moses made camp a respectful distance away, planning to monitor through the night. As darkness fell over the savannah, distant roars of other lions carried on the cool air, but Jabari remained silent. "In all my years photographing wildlife, I've never felt so invested in a single animal," Thomas admitted as they sat by their small campfire. "It feels different when you've documented something so intimate, that bird helping him, only to watch him deteriorate like this." "That's the danger of seeing ourselves in animals," Moses replied quietly. "We imagine the oxpecker felt compassion, that it wanted to help. Perhaps it did, or perhaps it simply found food in the wound. Nature rarely gives us clear stories with happy endings." Throughout the night, they took turns keeping watch. The pride remained nearby, occasionally shifting positions but never straying far from their stricken male. The oxpeckers had roosted somewhere unseen. Shortly before dawn, commotion from the pride's direction jolted Thomas awake. Grabbing his camera and night vision equipment, he scanned the area. The lionesses were on their feet, moving agitatedly around a still form on the ground. "Moses," Thomas called urgently. "Something's happening with Jabari." As first light broke over the horizon, bathing the savannah in soft gold, the full scene became visible. The lionesses and cubs had gathered around Jabari, who lay motionless on his side. Despite Dr. Kamani's intervention, the infection had progressed too far. The king of the savannah had succumbed during the night. "He's gone," Moses said simply, lowering his binoculars. "The antibiotics came too late." Thomas felt an unexpected tightness in his throat as he documented the pride's reaction. The lionesses moved around the fallen male, occasionally nudging him or vocalizing softly. The cubs, seemingly confused, alternated between playfulness and mimicking their mother's solemn behavior. Above this scene of natural mourning, a group of oxpeckers returned, circling before landing on a nearby tree. Their characteristic calls seemed somehow muted, though Thomas knew this was merely his own emotion coloring perception. Dr. Kamani returned mid-morning with 2 assistants to perform a field necropsy on Jabari's body. The procedure was necessary not only to determine the exact cause of death but also to monitor for diseases threatening the reserve's lion population. "I'd like to stay and document this, if you don't mind," Thomas said, maintaining a respectful distance. "This has become more than just a photography assignment." Dr. Kamani nodded. "Your documentation might actually prove valuable. We've been tracking an unusual pattern of infections and predators across several conservancies. This could help identify if there's a connection." The pride had retreated several hundred yards, the lionesses keeping the cubs safe while occasionally looking back. The oxpeckers remained in the acacia tree. As the veterinary team worked, Thomas photographed the process methodically. The necropsy revealed what Dr. Kamani had suspected: the infection had spread far beyond the original abscess, creating pockets of necrotic tissue throughout Jabari's neck and chest cavity. "Look at this," she said, beckoning Thomas closer. Using forceps, she extracted a small, irregular object from deep within the tissue. "This appears to be the source of the infection." Thomas peered at the object, a jagged metal fragment, roughly thumbnail-sized, its edges crusted with tissue and pus. "What is that? Part of a poacher's bullet?" Dr. Kamani examined it carefully. "No, too irregular for ammunition. My guess is shrapnel from a snare wire that snapped under tension. He must have been caught in a poacher's trap at some point, broke free, but carried this fragment with him. So this was human-caused after all," Thomas said quietly, a mixture of sadness and anger coloring his voice. Unfortunately, yes, Dr. Kamani confirmed. The metal fragment would have gradually worked through tissue, creating the abscess. When the oxpecker drained the surface infection, it provided temporary relief but couldn't reach this deeper fragment. The bacteria colonizing the metal continued spreading, eventually leading to systemic infection. Moses, who had been observing silently, spoke up. So the bird helped but couldn't save him. The bird actually gave him more time, Dr. Kamani replied. Without that drainage, he would have succumbed much sooner. Nature has its own physicians, but they have their limits. Thomas's photographs of Jabari's necropsy and the recovered metal fragment provided the final chapter in what had become a complex and poignant wildlife narrative. The story that emerged was far more nuanced than his initial documentation of an unusual interspecies interaction. 2 weeks later, in his Nairobi apartment, Thomas reviewed his final selections for the National Geographic article. The images told a powerful story: the majestic lion suffering from the abscess, the brave oxpecker methodically draining the wound, the temporary recovery as Jabari rejoined his pride, and finally, the grim discovery of the human-caused fragment that ultimately claimed his life. His phone rang, Melissa Chen, his editor at National Geographic, calling for their scheduled review. "These images are extraordinary, Thomas," she said after initial greetings. "But I'm concerned about the ending. It's pretty grim for our readers." Thomas had anticipated this reaction. Wildlife publications often preferred uplifting narratives of resilience rather than harsh realities, especially when human interference was involved. "The truth is grim, Melissa," he replied firmly. "This isn't just about an interesting bird-lion interaction anymore. It's about the invisible threats these animals face from human activity. That metal fragment could have been there for months or years before it created a crisis." A thoughtful pause on the line. "You're right," she finally conceded. "And there's a powerful conservation message here." The headline practically writes itself: the bird tried to save him, but human actions had already sealed his fate. Exactly, Thomas agreed, relief evident in his voice. But there's another element that makes it even more compelling. "What's that?" "The aftermath, what happened with the pride after Jabari died. It's why I extended my stay in the Mara." In the days following Jabari's death, Thomas had continued documenting the pride, capturing their adjustment to the loss. The story took an unexpected turn when a younger male lion appeared on the periphery, clearly intent on taking over. This was natural behavior. When a dominant male dies, others quickly move to claim his pride. But what happened next defied typical patterns. Rather than immediately challenging the lionesses, the new male approached cautiously, almost respectfully. More surprisingly, the lionesses neither immediately rejected nor accepted him, maintaining wary distance while allowing him to remain nearby. Most remarkable was the continued presence of the oxpeckers. The birds that had tried to help Jabari now frequently perched near the new male, who appeared to tolerate them just as his predecessor had. On Thomas's third day of observation, he captured extraordinary footage of the birds examining a small wound on the new lion's shoulder, seemingly performing the same service. "It's as if they've established a relationship with this particular pride," Thomas explained to Melissa, "not just with an individual lion, but with the social unit itself. I've consulted several ornithologists, and none have documented this kind of consistent association between oxpeckers and lions before." "That adds a hopeful note to the story," Melissa observed. "Life continuing, adaptations forming despite the tragedy." "Exactly. And there's one more thing that makes this even more remarkable," Thomas added. "Dr. Kamani has been studying tissue samples from Jabari, and she's found something unexpected. The bacteria around the metal fragment showed signs of initial response to treatment, not from the antibiotics she administered, which came too late, but from something else." "Something else? Like what?" "They found traces of organic antibacterial compounds in the tissue. The same compounds present in the saliva of certain bird species, including oxpeckers. It appears the birds weren't just draining the abscess, they were actively treating the infection with their saliva. They were genuinely trying to heal him." The discovery had profound implications for understanding mutualistic relationships in the wild. What had initially appeared as simple opportunistic feeding by the oxpecker revealed itself as something far more complex, a genuine symbiotic relationship with potential benefits for both species. 6 months later, Thomas stood at the entrance of the Nairobi National Museum, where his exhibition, The Lion's Physician, was opening to the public. The collection featured his documentation of Jabari, the oxpeckers, and the pride, alongside scientific information about the discovery of the bird's antibacterial saliva and its potential applications in wildlife medicine. The centerpiece was a large-format print showing the oxpecker perched beside Jabari's abscess, a moment of connection between two species that would normally occupy very different roles in the ecosystem. Beside it, a smaller image showed the metal fragment recovered during necropsy, with text explaining its human origin and the ongoing threat of poaching. "Your work has already made an impact," Moses told him during the opening reception. "The Kenya Wildlife Service has increased anti-snare patrols in the Mara by 30% since your article was published." Dr. Kimani, who had also attended, added, "And we've established a new protocol for monitoring interactions between oxpeckers and large predators." 3 research teams are now specifically focused on documenting these relationships across different reserves. As visitors moved through the exhibition, Thomas overheard their conversations, expressions of wonder at the bird's behavior, outrage at the human-caused suffering, and most importantly, discussions about conservation and coexistence. The story had transcended simple wildlife photography to become a catalyst for awareness and action. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned, Thomas found himself standing alone before the central image of Jabari and the oxpecker. The photograph captured a moment of vulnerability and connection that seemed to speak to something universal, the capacity for unlikely alliances in the face of adversity. A small girl approached, gazing up at the photograph with solemn curiosity. "Did the bird know the lion was sick?" she asked, noticing Thomas beside her. He considered the question carefully. "We can't know for certain what the bird understood," he replied. "But it recognized an opportunity to help itself while also helping the lion. That's how nature often works, different creatures finding ways to benefit each other." "But the lion still died," the girl observed, reading the accompanying text. "Yes, he did," Thomas acknowledged. "The bird couldn't save him from the human-caused injury. But the bird tried, and in doing so taught us something important about cooperation and healing in the wild." As the girl moved on with her parents, Thomas remained contemplating the image. Jabari's story had indeed ended tragically, but the narrative it spawned continued to evolve, in research inspired by the unusual relationship, in conservation efforts motivated by the preventable loss, and in countless minds touched by witnessing this brief but profound connection between bird and lion. In the unpredictable theater of the wild, where life and death played out according to ancient rhythms, moments of unexpected cooperation shone like beacons, reminding humans that the natural world still held countless mysteries and lessons yet to be fully understood. The horrible thing that happened days after the bird helped the lion wasn't the end of the story. It was a chapter in a continuing narrative of resilience, adaptation, and the endless complexity of life on the savanna.